Counter-Narrative News wants to bring you the subsequent comments that we're about to share in a clip from Julius Malema, who is the leader and the founder of the Economic Freedom Fighters, which is a radical anti-colonial socialist grassroots movement in South Africa. It's the third largest party. Julius Malema was also, before he was expelled from the African National Congress, was the leader of its youth wing. And basically, Julius Malema came into a clash with certain British neo-colonial interests in South Africa. The British authorities seemed to put pressure on the ANC in its displeasure with Julius Malema being the ANC youth leader, and Julius Malema was expelled by the ANC leadership. Now, the subsequent comments that we're going to just explore, which we're going to share in a second, is Julius Malema is arguing recently that the Russian state and its leadership is politically basically seamlessly the same as the Soviet Union, which existed from 1917 to 1991. Let's go to the comments, then we'll have some discussion.
Putin is welcomed. We know our friends. We know the people who liberated us. We know the people who supported us. In Kuto-Konaval, the weapons that were used in Kuto-Konaval that led to the liberation of South Africa were coming from Russia. Russia supplied us with weapons in Kuto-Konaval. Cuba supplied us with soldiers. MK was drunk. Cuba brought the soldiers. Russia brought the armaments.
Now, these comments are around the general controversy of whether Global South people and states should ally with Russia as beneficial to itself, and also specifically around the controversies of Russia doing a mass kidnap of occupied children in Ukraine and then sending them back to the country of the colonial aggressor, which is Russia. And Vladimir Putin has been indicted around that by the International Criminal Court, which is a neo-colonial body which is somewhat obsessed with only leaders around the world who are from Africa. Now, anyway, to the point. Now, it's just totally incorrect to say that the Russian leadership today and the Russian state is the same as that of the Soviet Union, which did give support to some anti-colonial struggles in Africa in the 50s and 1960s going into the 1970s. The Soviet state was a state that was in a global struggle strategically with Western imperialism and capitalism. From the leadership of Lenin to Stalin, Stalin is a much more right-wing nationalist and conservative leader, and the country was coloured similarly from the revolutionary, insurrectionary leadership of Lenin, who was very much on point about white supremacy and racism, Russian chauvinism and imperial revanchism, etc. He was an absolute trenchant enemy of all of that racist, nationalist trash. However, Stalin was a racist and a Russian nationalist, most graphically shown in his mass expulsion of several national oppressed peoples, including the Volga Germans, the Chechens, the Crimean Tatars, and the Koreans from the Far East, who were moved thousands of miles away from their communities. Now, nevertheless, the Soviet Union until 1991 was still deposited, despite its kind of degeneration and growing corruption and alienation of the working masses from the growing restoration of capitalism within the Soviet period. Nonetheless, it was still vested strategically across the globe, promoting socialist ideas, supporting socialist movements and socialist states. And in that, it did provide arms and support politically, diplomatically and materially to the African National Congress in South Africa and its struggle against white supremacy, apartheid. And also the communist Cuban state did give volunteers to the struggle in Angola against the Portuguese colonial state there, but also against the occupation of the apartheid South African armed forces in Namibia and in Angola, but particularly in Namibia as well. So the Soviet Union supported movements of the MPLA Liberation Movement, which is now the ruling party in Angola, of SWAPO, the Southwest African People's Organization, which is also a liberation movement, which is also the ruling party in Namibia today, and also the ANC. However, after 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union, Julius Malema is totally wrong, and others, one recognizes that George Galloway as well is promoting the same line. Now, Julius Malema is just wrong, and he knows he is involved in distorting and falsifying history here, because he knows very well that the Russian state today is in many ways the counter-opposite of the Soviet state. The Russian state, after the fall of Soviet socialism, was basically a creation of Western imperialism. Its public assets were looted and were sold off by the new Russian capitalist state. And it was just committed to a very gangster capitalist neoliberal type of capitalism, with all of the kind of growing imperial revanchism and the kind of nostalgia of the Russian imperial state kind of coming back and oppressing its minorities even further. And it was actually collaborating with Western imperialist leaders as well, which is well known, of Yeltsin's good relations with many of the West, despite some contradictions. And through Yeltsin into Putin, what you have basically is that the looting facilitated by the Russian state became so intense and immiserated the Russian people so dramatically that on the one hand, the Russian state was totally repressing any kind of socialist opposition or communist opposition, and it was allowing to grow a toxic right-wing nationalism with all of the homophobia and women's oppression and racism that comes with that. And that's the Russian state that we have today, which is, yes, in an antagonism with Western imperialism, because imperialism seeks total monopoly, and it doesn't treat lightly new competitors trying to challenge it in the global situation. Now, more clearly we can understand Russia's role today if we look at the NATO intervention and the destruction of Libya in 2011. Russia sat on its hands. Russia was quite happy to see the destruction of Gaddafi's Jamahiriya socialist state in Libya by NATO. It did absolutely nothing for this fundamentally important, historically important, for this phase in history of this several decades phase that we're living through. The NATO intervention in Libya is the most important thing to have happened to Africa. Of course, Gaddafi was a good comrade of Nelson Mandela, and he also did support the liberation movement of the South Africans against the apartheid regime. And so when it comes to the most critical juncture, historically most important moments around African challenges of independence and resistance against global capitalism and imperialism, you can see Russia basically allowed Libya to burn and be destroyed by NATO. Julius Malema knows this. Julius Malema also knows that he is developing a struggle quite successfully amongst the poorest African black communities in South Africa. Now, Malema is an interesting person. He's a bit of a slippery character. Nevertheless, whatever he might or might not be, what he's unleashed at the grassroots is very important in South Africa, and is very important clearly to the class struggle of people increasingly needing socialist demands as necessity for life in terms of sanitation, housing, employment, the energy crisis, and much more. But also, it's worth reflecting, whereas Julius Malema is arguing that a racist and a openly toxic nationalist colonial leadership in the form of Putin is welcome in South Africa, on the other hand, Julius Malema and the economic freedom fighters are demanding some basic socialist popular demands from the masses. And what's the response of the ANC? The response of the ANC is to flick them away, is to arrogantly dismiss all the demands of the South African masses, including as it's articulated by the economic freedom fighters and Julius Malema's leadership of that. And instead, it pushes them away, doubles down on its right-wing capitalist economic strategy going forward, and then wastes money in doing a naval exercise with China and Russia, when it could be using those resources to actually come to the support and the relief of the South African masses. So Julius Malema's position here actually is also very unethical and inconsistent with what appears that he's advocating from his political movement itself, and that's something very much worth reflecting upon. Also, to suggest that the people of South Africa, Angola and Namibia were somehow liberated by someone else. It's just not true. I mean, George Galloway says that everything that the ANC in the armed struggle of Umkhonto and Sizwe were eating in the African bush was all supplied by the Soviets. It's just a nonsense. No, people free themselves, people liberate themselves, and others can come to the assistance, and they can come to great assistance. But at the end of the day, unless the people are organized and there's a mass that can actually struggle and strategically overcome and win, then there is no struggle. The South Africans liberated themselves in alliance with others. The Angolans liberated themselves. Namibians liberated themselves. No one liberated them for them. They conducted it, and then they sought global alliances and support. Yes. So it's really important that we're very clear about what's going on here, because this is total lies, distortion and untruths and falsification of basic history and basic definitions of facts of what different states are. The Soviet Union, despite its kind of increasingly hollowed out nature and the restoration of capitalism within the Soviet period, was still promoting socialism and still supporting a global struggle against imperialism, despite whatever opportunism and narrow nationalist kind of things that were going on there. There's a longer discussion to have about what actually happened in the anti-colonial struggle in relation to the Lenin leadership, the Stalin leadership, and the Khrushchev and the Brezhnev, etc. Stalin didn't care one iota about Africa and vast places of Asia and Latin America. Absolutely didn't care about Asia. And the Soviet state only changed that position into the 50s and to the 60s. But there's other nuances and problematics there that we'll address going forward. It's very important for people to understand that the Russian leadership is a gangster capitalist leadership. It absolutely promotes a toxic form of right-wing colonial nationalist politics, toxic in its homophobia, in its approach to the women's question, in absolutely a toxic far-right white nationalist leadership that's constantly pumping that politics into the globe. So it's not a friend of the African masses or any other oppressed group. Yes, people can use a non-aligned strategy if it's people-centered, socialist-oriented in defense of their country and people. They can ally with whichever forces in the world, and they should in a non-aligned strategy, in a left revolutionary anti-imperialist non-aligned strategy, not a right-wing capitalist one where you oppress the people and you manipulate them and you try to fool the people like your oppression and exploitation of them through toxic right-wing politics is to their benefit. At the end of the day, the class struggle will show that the people will not fall for that, because their own class interests will push them beyond and over this distortion and falsification towards a greater liberation struggle. Many thanks.